Bumpy Johnson knew he was dying. The pain in his chest had been getting worse for weeks. On July 6, 1968, he woke up knowing it could be his final day. Still, he went to Wells' restaurant, as he always did. Same table, same breakfast. The Genovese family had sent word. They wanted to talk about heroin, about Harlem's future, about what would happen when the king was gone. Bumpy could have stayed home and spent his last hours in peace. Instead, he sat across from 3 mob enforcers and made a decision: protect his legacy or protect his life. He couldn't do both. He chose Harlem. If you walked through Harlem in the summer of 1968, you would see something dying. Not the buildings, not the music, not the people, but the soul. Heroin was seeping into the streets like poison gas, and everyone knew where it came from. The Italian mob, specifically the Genovese crime family. For 30 years, Bumpy Johnson had kept that poison out. He ran the numbers, controlled the gambling, and kept peace between the Irish, the Italians, and his own people. But he had one rule that never changed: no heroin in Harlem. Not in his neighborhood. Not while he was alive. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson wasn't breathing easily anymore. He was 62 years old. His heart was failing. Doctors at Harlem Hospital had told him 6 months earlier, slow down, retire, enjoy the time you have left. Hump had laughed. Retire. A man like him didn't retire. He worked until he died. And if he was going to die, it would be on his feet, not in a hospital bed. The Genovese family knew this. They had been watching and waiting. Vito Genovese himself was locked in federal prison in Atlanta, dying from a heart condition just like Bumpy, but his family was still powerful, still hungry, and they saw an opening. Harlem without Bumpy Johnson was an open market, a gold mine ready to be taken. The younger soldiers, the ones who didn't remember when Bumpy walked into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed in 1935 and walked out alive, thought it would be easy. Just wait for the old man to die, then move in. Set up heroin distribution, take over the numbers racket, turn Harlem into another profit center. But the older bosses remembered. They knew Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous dying than most men were in their prime. They knew you didn't simply walk into Harlem and take what you wanted while Bumpy was still alive. So they chose negotiation first. Make him an offer. Appeal to his business instincts. He was old, sick, dying. Surely he would want to secure his family's future. Surely he would want one last payday. On July 6, 1968, 3 men in expensive suits climbed into a black Cadillac in Little Italy and drove uptown to Harlem. Their names were Anthony, Tony, Peels, Lentini, Joseph, Joey Surprise Stacy, and a young soldier named Paulie Fortunato. They were armed. They were connected. Joey Surprise carried a black leather briefcase filled with $100,000 in cash. They had no idea they were driving toward their own humiliation. Wells' restaurant sat on the corner of 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. It wasn't fancy. Red leather booths worn smooth by decades of use. A black and white checkered floor. The smell of bacon grease and coffee brewing since dawn. The walls were lined with photographs of Harlem legends Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and, in the corner, a framed photo of Bumpy Johnson shaking hands with Muhammad Ali. It was Bumpy's place. His table was in the back corner, facing the door. Always facing the door. An old habit from the days when enemies came through doors with guns, not contracts. That morning, Bumpy was alone. His wife, Mame, had begged him not to go. She felt something in the air, the way women who live with dangerous men learn to sense danger before it arrives. But Bumpy kissed her forehead, straightened his tie, and told her he'd be home by noon. He always wore a suit, even for breakfast. Respect, he used to say. Respect yourself, respect others. He ordered his usual scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, wheat toast, black coffee. He was reading the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper. It's an article about the garbage workers' strike. When the restaurant door opened and the three men walked in, the entire restaurant grew quiet. Not the sudden silence of shock, but the slow fading of conversation as people realized what was happening. The waitress, a woman named Dorothy, who had worked at Wells for 20 years, froze mid-pour. Her hand trembled slightly, coffee spilling onto the counter. Everyone in Harlem knew what Italian suits in a black neighborhood meant. Business, the kind that usually ended badly for someone. Bumpy didn't look up from his newspaper. He took a slow sip of coffee, calmly turned the page, and waited. He had been expecting this. Word traveled fast in both worlds, and he knew the Genovese family was planning a move. He knew they would send someone sooner or later. He just hadn't known it would be today. Tony Peels stepped forward first. He was the talker, the negotiator, a capo in his mid-40s who had built his reputation. Running bookmaking operations in the Bronx, Joey Surprise stayed by the door, blocking it, his eyes scanning the room for trouble. The black leather briefcase hung heavy in his hand. Polly, the youngest, barely 25, stood behind Tony, trying to look tough, trying to look like he belonged in the same room as Bumpy Johnson. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, his voice respectful but firm. "Mind if we sit?" Bumpy slowly folded his newspaper, taking his time. He looked up at Tony with those cold, calculating eyes that had stared down mob bosses, crooked cops, and killers for 30 years. Eyes that had watched men die without blinking. Then he nodded toward the booth across from him. "Free country." The three men slid into the booth. Dorothy approached, her hands shaking slightly, and asked if they wanted coffee. Tony waved her away without looking at her. This wasn't a social visit. This was business. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds in Wells' restaurant were the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the low murmur of whispers from other tables, and the ticking of the old Coca-Cola clock on the wall. Everyone inside was watching, pretending not to watch. Across the street, inside a parked Buick, two of Bumpy's men sat watching through the window. Big Jack Turner and Raymond Slim Washington. They had been there since 6:30 that morning, drinking cold coffee and waiting. Bumpy never went anywhere without protection. Not in 1968. Not with the streets growing more dangerous. Young punks getting bold, and old rules breaking down. Tony Peels finally broke the silence. He nodded toward Joey Surprise, who stepped away from the door. Joey placed the black leather briefcase on the table between Bumpy and Tony, right beside Bumpy's coffee cup. The kind of briefcase bankers carried. The kind serious money traveled in. The metal latches snapped open, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet restaurant. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills bound with bank straps. A lot of them. The money was real, visible, tempting. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, lowering his voice into the confidential tone businessmen use when proposing something they know is wrong but profitable. "We're here with respect, with a business proposition I think you'll find very generous." Bumpy didn't touch the briefcase. He didn't even look inside. His eyes stayed fixed on Tony's face. "I'm listening." Tony leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, away from the open case. "The world is changing, Mr. Johnson. You know that better than anyone. The young people don't want numbers anymore. They don't want policy slips or betting pools. They want something stronger, something that makes them forget about Vietnam, forget about poverty, forget about everything. They want heroin." P's expression never changed. He took another sip of coffee, his hand steady. Tony continued, gesturing toward the open briefcase. "Whether you like it or not, it's coming to Harlem. The demand is already there. The supply routes are established. We've got connections in Marseille and Turkey." He gestured toward the open briefcase. Whether you liked it or not, it was coming to Harlem. The demand already existed. The supply routes were in place. Connections stretched from Marseille to Turkey to Southeast Asia. The product would flow. The only question was who would control it. He pointed to the stacks of money. $100,000 in cash, tax-free, untraceable. And it was only a down payment. They were offering 30% of all heroin profits in Harlem. Bumpy wouldn't have to do anything. No distributing. No risk. Just stop blocking them. Let them operate. He would keep his territory. They would keep theirs. Everyone would profit. The briefcase sat between them on the table. Neatly stacked bills bound with bank straps. Bumpy could see the top denominations. Hundreds. Real money. Serious money. A fortune. Enough to take care of Mame for the rest of her life. Enough to buy property, invest, leave something behind beyond the streets. Enough to die comfortably. But Bumpy Johnson had never cared about dying comfortably. Polly, the young one, couldn't keep quiet. Youth and arrogance, Bumpy thought. A dangerous mix. With all respect, Mr. Johnson, Polly said, you're not a young man anymore. You've had a good run. 30 years at the top. That's more than most men get. Why fight this? Take the money. Enjoy your time. Live to see your grandchildren grow up. We're going to do this with or without you. This is just us showing respect to a legend. That was when Bumpy's eyes moved from Tony to Polly. The temperature in the booth dropped. Dorothy, refilling water glasses 3 tables away, felt it. The other customers felt it. Even Tony Pills felt it, and he reached for Polly's arm. Too late. How old are you, son? Bumpy asked. His voice was calm, almost casual. Polly straightened, trying to look tough, trying to hide the knot tightening in his stomach under Bumpy's stare. 25. 25. Bumpy nodded slowly. You know how old I was when I walked into Luciano's office in Manhattan and told him he couldn't touch Harlem without my permission. Polly didn't answer. He didn't know. 29. 4 years older than you. You know what Lucky told me? He said I was crazy. Said I was a dead man walking. Said his organization would crush me like a bug. That was 1935, 33 years ago. Bumpy paused. And here I am, still breathing, still in Harlem. And Lucky died in Italy, in exile, in 1962. Heart attack. Same thing that's going to kill me. He turned back to Tony. Where's Vito Genovese right now, Tony? Tony shifted uncomfortably. He's in federal prison, Mr. Johnson. You know that? Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Heart disease. Just like me, Bumpy said. Dying the same way. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Funny how that works. We spend our lives fighting each other, and in the end, it's our own hearts that finish us. Tony tried to regain control. Mr. Johnson, nobody's disrespecting you. We know your history. We know what you've built. But times change. The old ways, the old codes, the old ways. Bumpy interrupted, his voice quiet but sharp as a razor. You think you're offering me something new? You think I haven't seen this before? Heroin isn't new, Tony. It's been knocking on Harlem's door since the 20s. After the First World War. Then again after the Second. Okay. And every single time I slammed that door shut. Tony stayed silent. You know why? Bumpy continued. Because I've seen what it does. I watched it destroy Chinatown in the 30s. I watched it hollow out neighborhoods in Chicago. I watched it turn human beings into walking corpses. And I promised this community that as long as I was breathing, that poison wouldn't flow through Harlem. He reached across the table and snapped the briefcase shut. The latches clicked with finality. Then he pushed it back toward Tony. The scrape of leather against wood echoed through the silent restaurant. I don't want your money, Bumpy said. And I don't want your poison in my neighborhood. Joey's surprise spoke from near the door, his voice harder than Tony's. Bumpy, be reasonable. You can't stop this. You're one man. We're an organization. We've got muscle, connections, politicians on the payroll. What do you have? A few old numbers runners and a reputation. Bumpy looked at Joey. then at Tony, then at Polly. For the first time since they'd sat down, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who had faced death before and wasn't afraid of it. The smile of a man who had already made his peace. "Let me tell you something about Harlem," Bumpy said, his voice steady despite the tightness building in his chest. "You think it's just another neighborhood, just another market, just another revenue stream." He shook his head slowly. "Harlem is a promise to the people who built it with their hands. A promise to the people who came up from the South looking for freedom and found it here. A promise to the kids growing up on these streets that there's another way besides crime, besides drugs, besides destroying yourself to make white men in downtown offices rich." He pointed at the closed briefcase. "You bring that garbage into Harlem. You're not just selling drugs. You're selling death. You're selling hopelessness. You're taking young men who could have been doctors, lawyers, teachers, leadersmen who could have changed the world, and you're turning them into addicts and corpses." Tony Pills shifted in his seat. "Mr. Johnson, we're businessmen. We're not responsible for what people choose to do." "Murderers." Bumpy's voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. Dorothy dropped a spoon behind the counter. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. "Don't dress it up with words like business and choice," Bumpy said. "You're murderers. You sell poison. You destroy families. You kill communities. And you want me to shake your hand and help you do it?" The pain in his chest was starting now. Bumpy could feel it. A tightening, a crushing pressure, like a vice slowly closing around his heart. His left arm began to tingle. He knew the signs. He had seen men die this way before. His own father had died like this, clutching his chest in a cotton field in South Carolina in 1922. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't finished yet. "Here's my answer to your proposition," Bumpy said, locking eyes with each of them. First Tony, then Joey, then young Paulie, who couldn't hold his gaze and looked away. "You can bring your heroin to Harlem over my dead body. And even then, the people I've taught, the lessons I've lived, they'll fight you every step of the way. You'll never control Harlem. Not like you control Little Italy or the Bronx. Not while there's one person left who remembers what I stood for." The pain sharpened. His breathing grew harder, shorter. But Bumpy Johnson had one more thing to say. 7 words that would be repeated in Harlem for the next 50 years. 7 words that would become his epitaph. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Tony Pills. "Harlem doesn't bow. Not now. Not ever." The pain slammed into him like a sledgehammer. His hand flew to his chest, gripping his shirt. His coffee cup slipped from his other hand and shattered on the floor. Black liquid spreading across the checkered tiles like blood. Dorothy screamed from behind the counter. "Oh God, somebody call an ambulance." Before anyone could move, the restaurant door burst open. 4 men rushed in. Big men, Harlem men. Big Jack Turner led them, his 6'4" frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Raymond Slim Washington, Marcus the Deacon Williams, and a young enforcer named Cleveland, who worked security for Bumpy's Policy Banks. They'd been watching from across the street the whole time. They saw the Italians enter. They waited. When they saw Bumpy clutch his chest through the window, they ran. Big Jack's eyes moved from Bumpy gasping for air to the 3 Italians in the booth, then to the black briefcase on the table. "What did you do to him?" Big Jack's voice was cold, murderous. Tony Pills went pale. He raised his hands instinctively, showing he was unarmed. "Nothing. We were just talking. I swear to God, we didn't." He just grabbed his chest. "You brought poison to his table," Big Jack said, stepping closer, his massive hands curling into fists. "You disrespected him in his own neighborhood, and now he's dying in front of you." Okay. That was when Tony Pills understood. Joey, surprise, understood. And young Polly understood too, his face shifting from cocky to terrified in seconds. It didn't matter what actually happened. It didn't matter that Bumpy was 62, that his heart was failing, that this might have happened that day, no matter what. What mattered was how it looked. 3 Italian mobsters sitting across from Bumpy Johnson when he collapsed in Harlem. The witnesses in a neighborhood that loved him like a father. They would be torn apart before an ambulance ever arrived. Joey's surprise was already backing toward the door, the briefcase still in his hand. Polly's hand drifted toward his jacket, toward his gun. Big Jack caught his wrist in a grip like steel. You pull that gun, boy, and you'll never leave this neighborhood. None of you will. There'll be 3 bodies in the East River by sunset. Through the pain, through the crushing pressure in his chest, through the struggle to breathe, Bumpy spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the terrified silence of Wells' restaurant, everyone heard it. Let them go. Big Jack looked down at him, confused, furious. Boss, let them go, Bumpy repeated. His breathing was ragged now, every word an effort. I want them to tell their bosses. He looked directly at them. He stared at Tony Peels, who sat frozen in the booth, too afraid to move, too afraid to stay. Tell them Harlem doesn't bow. Big Jack released Polly's wrist. He stepped aside, clearing a path to the door, but his eyes promised violence if they ever returned. Tony Peels grabbed the briefcase from the table. Witness problem. The 3 Italians didn't walk, they ran. Joey clutching the briefcase, Polly and Tony right behind him. Out the door and into their Cadillac. Tires screaming as they tore out of Harlem. They weren't running from Bumpy. They were running from the fury of an entire neighborhood. From the knowledge that if Bumpy Johnson died with them in the room, they would be blamed, and Harlem would come for them. Every corner, every alley, every rooftop there would be nowhere safe. Better to run. Better to disappear. Back inside Wells' restaurant, Dorothy was at Bumpy's side, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. Big Jack shouted for someone to call the hospital. Customers gathered around, some crying, some praying. Bumpy looked up at Dorothy and managed to smile. A real smile this time, soft and genuine. Tell Mame, he whispered. Tell her I'm sorry I missed lunch. Those were his last words. At 8:52 a.m. on July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out. 5 minutes after the meeting with the Genovese family's representatives. 5 minutes after he turned down $100,000. 5 minutes after he chose principle over survival. He died sitting in his booth at Wells' restaurant, the same place he had eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for 20 years. He died surrounded by his community, people who knew him, respected him, loved him. He died free, unbought, unbowed. The funeral was held 5 days later at Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. More than 5,000 people came to pay their respects. The line stretched 6 blocks down 7th Avenue. People who had never met Bumpy, people who had only heard the stories, people whose parents had told them about the man who kept Harlem safe. They all came to say goodbye. True to form, the Italian mob tried to move in after Bumpy's death. For about 6 months, they pushed heroin into Harlem, believing the king was gone and the throne was empty. They were wrong. The old guard. The numbers runners who had worked with Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy since the 1930s. The local operators who remembered the codes. The street-level figures who had learned by watching Bumpy balance legitimacy and the underworld. They remembered what he stood for. They remembered his words. Harlem doesn't bow, but history demands honesty. Bumpy's death did create a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Within a few years, younger hustlers who didn't remember Bumpy's rules, who hadn't learned the difference between taking what you need and destroying your own community, began bringing heroin into Harlem in larger amounts. They told themselves they were different, smarter, that they could control it, that they could profit without destroying the neighborhood. They were wrong. The heroin epidemic Bumpy died fighting came anyway. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Harlem suffered. Families were destroyed. Young men and women became addicts. The nightmare Bumpy tried to prevent became reality. But history often misses this part. Statistics don't capture it. It was harder because of Bumpy. The Italian mob never fully controlled Harlem the way it controlled Little Italy. Today, the Bronx, or parts of Brooklyn, local operators kept some autonomy. The community remembered there was another way, even when they couldn't always live it. When the worst came when crack cocaine hit in the 1980s, there were still people in Harlem who remembered Bumpy Johnson's stand. They spoke his name. They reminded the young, once we had a man who said no. Once we had a king who chose principle over profit. Once we had a leader who would rather die than betray his community. That memory mattered. It still does. Tony Pills kept a black leather briefcase for the rest of his life. He never opened it again after that day. Never deposited the money. Never spent a single dollar. The $100,000 stayed exactly as it had been stacked that morning, same bundles, same bank straps, untouched. He kept it locked in a safe in his basement in Queens. From time to time, when younger mobsters came to him looking for advice, for wisdom, for stories about the old days, he would take out that briefcase, open it, and show them the money. This, he would say, pointing to the neat stacks of bills, is what happens when you disrespect a king. This is what happens when you think money can buy everything. Bumpy Johnson was dying. We offered him a fortune, and he chose death instead. Then he would close the briefcase and lock it back in the safe. That's honor. That's principle. That's something we've forgotten how to do. Tony Peels died in 1987 from lung cancer. After the funeral, his son, Anthony Jr., found the briefcase in the basement safe. He opened it and saw the money still inside, still bundled. The bills yellowed with age, but untouched. Inside was a handwritten note. Give this to the Schomburg Center in Harlem. It belongs to them, not to us. Let them know it's the money Bumpy Johnson refused. The money that proved he couldn't be bought. The briefcase and its contents were reportedly donated anonymously to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in 1988. The museum has never officially confirmed it, but curators who have worked there for decades will quietly tell you that somewhere in the archives, there is a black leather briefcase containing $100,000 in 1968 bills, a memorial to the day a dying man said no. Wells Restaurant closed in 1982, a casualty of changing neighborhoods and rising rents, before the building was torn down to make room for a parking garage. A group of Harlem residents commissioned a small brass plaque. They placed it on the wall where Bumpy's booth had once stood, just before the demolition crew arrived. It remained there for only one day before the building came down. But someone took a photograph. That photograph circulated throughout Harlem. The words on the plaque were repeated, memorized, passed down. It read, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 1905 to 1968, the man who never bowed. In this place, he chose honor over life. Even today, if you walk through Harlem, you'll still hear his name. Old-timers sitting on stoops, playing dominoes, drinking coffee, telling stories about the day Bumpy faced down Lucky Luciano and walked out alive. About the time he stopped a riot with a single gesture. About the morning he sat across from the Italian mob and said no with his dying breath. The stories aren't always exact. Details blur. Timelines mix. Legends merge with facts. But the truth remains. Once Harlem had a king who couldn't be bought. Once a man chose his community over his comfort. Once someone showed the world that some things matter more than money, more than power, more than life itself. That is Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the gambling, not the violence, not the criminal empire, but the moment when he had to choose between living a few more months in comfort or dying on his principles. He chose to die standing, and in doing so, he showed Harlem He showed all of us what real strength looks like. Not the strength to hurt others, not the strength to accumulate wealth, but the strength to say no when everyone expects yes. The strength to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. The strength to live by principle in a world that rewards compromise. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart stopped beating, but his words kept echoing. Harlem doesn't bow. Not now, not ever. And 56 years later, those words still matter. They still inspire. They still remind us that we have choices, that we have agency, that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can stand up. We can say no. We can choose principle over survival even when it costs everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that honor still matters in a world that has forgotten what it means.